There's a sense also of being a part of history. It doesn't matter where you are in British society today. You will probably remember today in some ways. And let me tell you a sort of oddly British and South African story. I remember speaking to a woman who told me the story of being a South African in a British hospital on the day that Nelson Mandela was released from jail, and how the entire hospital came to watch TV with her because she was the South African, to watch this amazing TV event. These were British people getting close to the only South African in the hospital. She was a patient there, just because they wanted to be close to the event. I think there's a sort of similar, I think you're exactly right when you talk about our 1994 elections. You will remember where you were in Britain. You're absolutely going to remember where you were today.
Absolutely. It is a part of history. And, I'm no great expert on the monarchy, but, really this tradition of a constitutional monarch limited his or her powers limited by the people really goes back to the time of the Normans, to the time of King John and the Magna Carta. And of course, King John, the Norman king, then had a lot more power than Queen Elizabeth ever did, or even Queen Victoria and the Georges and Edwards before her. But there is something quite extraordinary in that kind of national symbol of unity that the Queen stands for British people, and yet the absolute freedom that people have as living in a liberal democracy.
There's another aspect of the power of this, and you make the point that the British monarchy doesn't have any power, but there's a power in another way, and I'm talking about a cultural power. You and I are in South Africa now, a country in Africa. We're having this conversation in English. And I've been struck by how almost anywhere in the English-speaking world, people have referred to her, since she passed, as the Queen. Now, she's not a queen of any people of South Africa, insofar as I know. We have our own queens, but people have been referring to her as the Queen. And that, I think, speaks to an immense cultural power, a kind of soft power that the British monarchy has had. And there are lots of reasons for that. There's history, there's the Commonwealth, there are other things. But I think there's immense power in being able to be referred to as the Queen. I don't know anyone else who's had that power.
That's absolutely right. And a lot of that goes down to her completely wonderful behavior in the 70 years that she was monarch. She behaved beyond reproach. She went through some personal agonies, as we all know, and yet her behavior was always beyond reproach. I met her once in 1995 when she came to visit South Africa, very tellingly and importantly after the democratic elections, after apartheid was ended. She never came to South Africa since 1947, when she made that famous speech in Cape Town, until apartheid had ended. And we were there talking to her on the Royal Yacht Britannia, and she looked at me. I was with some Canadians and a German colleague, and the Canadians were, "Hi, Your Majesty, we're Canadians," and she was gracious to them. But when I said, "Your Majesty, I'm South African," she absolutely changed. In a very kind of subtle way, because she's obviously was deeply in control of her emotions and thoughts. But she looked at me and she said, "I do so love South Africa." And it was really warm and heartfelt. And then my German colleague, I guess it's part of a tribute to her that he felt so comfortable to speak like that. He said, "Yes, Your Majesty, but the crime here is terrible now, And he went on to relate a long story of how his colleague's camera equipment had been stolen out of his house in Melville. And the Queen clearly wasn't entirely sure what to say. And she looked at him and said, "Well, it must be so terribly difficult for young people these days." And of course it was a polite sort of riposte. But at the same time, she wasn't thrown by it, and she behaved so graciously. And it was quite amusing. And I felt really that she was somehow able to be comfortable with us for that very brief moment for us. Of course, she won't remember that. But it was a powerful moment.
I think there's something there. There's a sense of the diplomatic skill. It's not actually very easy to put people at ease. People may, if you have a very high profile, and I've been lucky enough, as you have, to meet some people who are incredibly sort of famous or have immense power. Some people make an effort to put you at ease, and some don't. She clearly did.
Yeah, she really did. And I have to say, I do think that being in South Africa was something special for her, and she really wanted to get as much as she could out of it. That's a feeling. I can't say that I have a great knowledge of it, but certainly she and King Charles now have had a long affinity with South Africa, as has Prince Harry, and I think that's something that we should be pleased about.
Mm. There are other issues. I mean, in the UK, a country which I think has been growing increasingly divided for various reasons. There's inequality not on the scale of the racialized inequality that we have, but sort of intergenerational inequality. Older people have been getting a lot more money than younger people. Younger people simply cannot buy a home in the way that their parents did. They've got an energy price crisis now. And then the divisions around Brexit, which really almost seem to have divided Britain into sort of two different groups of people. Not really, but sort of. Then we have these long queues, people queuing together. We can see them on our screen now for 24 hours just to sort of be a part of this. Do you think this plays a role in healing some of the divisions in a country like the UK?
That's a really interesting question, and I think that question remains open. There's no question that Scotland, for example, has a very strong sense of wanting to break away from the union that has been there since the early 18th century. And that is a very powerful movement. But the respect for the Queen herself, I think, is unparalleled. Northern Ireland, I don't even know enough, but it's certainly everybody knows it's a really, really deep problem that goes back centuries. It's quite possible that King Charles will be the king who presides over the devolution of the United Kingdom, and it seems almost certain that a number of Commonwealth countries who have the Queen as their head of state or the monarch as their head of state will possibly declare themselves as republics. I think those questions remain very open, and the Queen always somehow unified people, at least emotionally. Whether that translates into political power or connection is a much more open question.
It's so interesting to watch all of this play out and to see, the sort of pomp and ceremony. They really know how to put on a production, the Brits, don't they?
Oh, it's fantastic. I mean, I worked for the BBC for some 20, 25 years of my life as a regular freelancer. And I'm sure it's all the broadcasters coming together, but it's just extraordinary. I mean, it's been planned for decades. And, the ceremony of old London and the soldiers and the colours and the trooping of the guards, I mean, it really is something, a spectacle to revel in.
It's a spectacle that requires an immense amount of hard work. I mean, as you say, years in the planning, probably 30 years at least, where people have literally been planning for this for such a long time.
Well, absolutely. And, I don't know enough about it, but I've been told that there are all sorts of ancient rituals that have not been seen since the Queen's father died. And I'm thinking of something I saw late last week or early in the weekend when they went around with some trumpets to the city of London's mayor, and they went to other major cities in Britain, and they announced that King Charles would be taking over. I mean, that's something you're only going to see once in your life, and it's probably been happening certainly since the 1500s or so, perhaps as much as 1,000 years ago, back to, William the Conqueror, perhaps. I'm not entirely sure. There's lots of British people who will correct me, no doubt, but certainly there's at least 1,000 years of transition of royalty, with a slight break, of course, in the 1600s for the interregnum, when Oliver Cromwell and his Roundheads kicked King Charles I off the throne, beheaded him. And then a vicious and brutal civil war emerged, which was only finished sort of 20 years later or so, and the accession of Charles II to the throne. And now we have Charles III, and let's see what that means.
There's one something that's worth considering about the British system. So in our system, our head of state is the president, and that's always a political person. That's a person elected by Parliament, usually the leader of the governing party. In the British system, people don't swear an oath to the president or to the constitution. They swear an oath to, used to be the Queen, now the King. And that person sits above, sort of represents the country in a way. Sits above a political figure. I wonder if there's something that's worth drawing from that, or not really. I can see endless debates about it. But it's interesting that you have a person, some other countries do this as well, you have a sort of apolitical figure as head of state, because that means that there's someone else who people can look to, can sort of think about, can swear allegiance to, rather than a political figure. It's a really interesting conversation, and there's probably a reason why different countries have done this in different ways, because it is so complicated.
Yeah, look, I mean, that is the genius, perhaps, of the British system. I mean, I was browsing through some English history this weekend, which was prompted by all the events happening. And, there is no written constitution for the monarch and for what the limits of the monarch's power are. And the same, I'm not particularly religious, but the monarch is the head of the Church of England. And there's no written limits on what he or she may decide to decree about religious freedom, and there are no written limits on what he or she may decree about political freedom. But should he or she try to take over from Parliament in any kind of way, that certainly would come to a screeching halt. So, Britain has managed to keep an ancient tradition and an ancient sense of self and of unity, together with an extraordinary political ability to allow people personal autonomy within their lives. And that is the great genius of the British system that in some ways we've inherited in this country.
It really is about, in a way, personal freedoms, and yet the sort of allegiance is voluntary, and yet so many people we're now seeing are sort of showing that allegiance. The other thing about a procession like this that, goes all the way through different places and goes to Windsor Castle is that you actually see an awful lot of London. You actually see a big part of Britain. We saw that, and I will never forget it, and I'm sure you won't either, Hamilton, but at the funeral and the events leading up to the funeral of Nelson Mandela in Qunu, and you started to see parts of the country, people saw them on television for a long period of time in a way they hadn't before. And it's a sort of reminder of what the country actually is. In a way, South Africa is, very much, a sort of the Eastern Cape, a sort of rural country, in a way. Here in Britain, what we're seeing is how different the country can be, from the centre of London all the way through to Windsor. It's not getting out of the south of England, of course.
Yeah, I mean, let's take that back to Nelson Mandela's funeral, because Nelson Mandela, of course, was a highly active and effective political figure all his life. But he also came to symbolize freedom, personal autonomy, reconciliation, things that are really important, and which South Africa, which had been a symbol of real racial hatred, became a symbol of racial reconciliation. Now, we know, of course, we've got a long way to go, particularly in realizing that economically. But it should never be forgotten that that freedom and that struggle to achieve that freedom was something that brought a diverse population together. And the Queen does that too in Britain. I was watching last night some people in Scotland, which, as I've said earlier, has a very strong independence movement. But the respect for the Queen herself was extraordinary.
Shows you in a way how someone's actions can really matter. People can symbolize things, and I think there's been a conversation around what the British Queen has symbolized. For many people, symbol of a sort of colonial state, a state that colonized South Africa and other places. And yet, through her own sort of graciousness, I think is also, there's a sort of duality to this conversation. In Britain, and I've been fascinated by this, Hamilton, in Britain for the last sort of 11 days, there's been no other story, no other topic of discussion apart from this. So all of the other debates have been kind of paused. And it's interesting, I think the same happened here again with Madiba, that our sort of topics and conversations and developments and politics sort of paused. And when you hit the play button again, I don't really know what happens. I don't know if Britain's politicians will be back at it, shouting at each other and insulting each other. Boris Johnson is gone now. Or whether it'll sort of somehow be different for a couple of days. Maybe, maybe not.
I don't think it should be different. I think the politicians should shout at each other. They've got a lot to shout at each other about. And that is what makes Britain's constitutional monarchy work, is that really certainly since the days of Charles II and the restoration of the monarchy, his or her power has been limited and people are free to argue and discuss and debate. And there are some very serious issues that need to be dealt with in Britain. So I think that's part of the wonder and the genius of the British system, as far as I know it, is that you can have those rancorous debates and should have those rancorous debates, but yet you are still British at the core of it, and you have something that gives you more than that, and that's represented by the monarchy.
There's a real interesting sense of identity here, and I think in South Africa we've seen, and I would say the peak of a sort of South African identity perhaps, although, you can't really say it peaks and troughs, but a South African identity really has started to emerge since 1994. It was very different before. In a way, the Queen was very much a part of a British person's identity. Unlike us, you actually sang to her every time you sang your national anthem. Very different to what we do.
Well, absolutely. I was thinking about that. The national anthem is now God Save the King, not God Save the Queen, of course. And if Britain ever did become a republic, which I highly doubt will happen in any time in even the medium or long-term future, I think the future of the monarchy is quite well assured, with King Charles and then King William and then King George waiting in the wings. I think that it remains popular. It may well not be as popular as it was during Queen Elizabeth's time, but look, you simply cannot have monarchs ruling over people any longer in a meaningful political sense. That died a long time ago and certainly came to, excuse me, I'm just coughing on all this dusty air.
I'm just thinking about how your comment about how a monarch cannot rule over people will go down in Eswatini. But anyway, continue, Hamilton.
Well, absolutely, and I would suspect that a very large number of people in Eswatini would agree with me. The king might not, but that's a discussion for another day. I am a Republican. I think that Republican form of government, representative government of the people, by the people, etc., is exactly what the modern world should have and should strive towards in making it more and more representative and more efficient. And that's something that we are failing to do in this country. But yet we have freedom. We have personal autonomy, something we never had under apartheid. And that is something that the British sorted out for themselves in the reign of King Charles II back in the 1600s.
There's so much sort of to look at and so much to sort of ponder. In a way, I suppose, because of the length of the reign of the British Queen, 70 years, because of the length of the monarchical system in the UK, sort of call it 1,000 years, depending on where you want to start. A lot of people started Magna Carta in, I think, 1210. But I mean, there's so many different aspects to look at all of this. And I do think that Britain itself, if you look at the economics of it, is going to enter a tough time. It's summer there now, the end of summer. And this summer in Britain will be remembered for this. It was remembered as a long, hot summer before this, an angry summer. It's now going to be remembered for the passing of the British Queen, but it's likely to be a very difficult winter for that country. It's going to be a very cold winter because they're not going to have much energy in what they do have. It's going to be incredibly expensive.
I'm sure that's correct, but that is likely to unify the Brits. And certainly I don't think anybody can blame the monarch for that. I think we can squarely blame Vladimir Putin and his illegal and inhumane invasion of Ukraine. The monarch now, the king, I wouldn't say stands above that because, of course, he's part of his era. But I don't think that will threaten the monarchy in any way whatsoever.
Hamilton Wende, thank you. Television reporter and producer, journalist who's been literally around the world, as you heard, freelancing for the BBC for over 20 years. I really appreciate your time. Well.